Welcome, everyone. Before we get into the meat of today's topic, I wanted to introduce myself a bit and perhaps talk about why we're all here before exploring where the rest of the series will go. I'm Marie Brownhill, and I've been a Star Trek fan for as long as I can remember. Some of my earliest memories are of watching the animated series on Saturday mornings when it ran in syndication on cable, and something about Star Trek really caught my imagination. I think initially it was a matter of the strange new worlds and new civilizations Trek brought into my household, but as time moved on and I grew older, the deeper moral structure embedded in the franchise became increasingly important to me, especially when the next generation introduced me to Captain Picard and a crew that embraced the idea of infinite diversity more explicitly. Growing up in rural South Georgia, TNG offered me a very different narrative. Very different narrative than the one with which I found myself surrounded. Deep Space Nine only continued to push that envelope, challenging the images and stereotypes in the society in which I lived. I believe quite strongly that I'm a better person for having spent as much time with Starfleet as I have over the years, and I certainly hope I can share a little bit of that with all of you. If you know anything about Star Trek, you're probably wondering why we're addressing Star Trek in a lecture series on Christian formation, and that's an entirely fair question. Gene Roddenberry viewed religion, and to a lesser extent faith, with a great deal of distrust, and that attitude colors his vision of the future. Thus, in both the original series and TNG, the characters are explicitly atheist. If you've seen Who Watches the Watchers, TNG portrays atheism as a societal good. In that episode, one of Picard's very real concerns is that exposing a Bronze Age culture to Federation technology would prompt them to return to religion. The episode establishes both that the Montaukans, the Bronze Age society in question, have moved beyond belief in a god, and that doing so is an indication of positive societal evolution. Deep Space Nine will revisit the issue of faith, but significantly the prophets the Bajorans worship are timeless aliens rather than divine. So why Star Trek? There are two major reasons. The first is that Star Trek offers us a vision of the future that is utopian. Roddenberry offered viewers a conception of the future in which humanity resolves its issues, from prejudice to scarcity to pollution. Even in terms of the show's timeline, it takes us a while to get there, but we eventually do. Secondly, the franchise has enough history that we can get a really good look at Trek's vision of just what constitutes a utopia. Moreover, Trek's history spans decades, meaning that we have the opportunity to determine whether that vision has changed over the years as society has evolved from the 60s to 2022. I plan to make the argument that the vision has not only changed, but has changed specifically with respect to how Trek both defines and treats the other, the outsider. As Christians, most specifically as Episcopalians, our catechism states that the first and greatest commandment is to love the Lord our God with all our hearts, all our minds. The second is like unto it, love thy neighbor as thyself. Upon these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Sorry, y'all, I'm a die-hard Right One fangirl. The link between these concepts is this. If Star Trek represents a vision of a utopia in which we treat our neighbors completely fairly, what does that look like? Does Star Trek live up to its aspirations? Is there something we can learn from Trek's vision of utopia that we can then apply to our lives and our faith? I'm here, so clearly I think the answer to most of these questions is yes. I hope that these discussions will give you all the opportunity to find answers to those questions as well. To that end, I'm selecting 4 episodes across 4 different franchise installments to jumpstart our exploration. We'll start with the original series and the Galileo 7, and then we'll move to TNG with Thine Own Self, and then into Voyager and Deep Space Nine. If we have time, I'll try to throw in some thoughts on Enterprise. All that being said, let's get into the meat of this episode. Like I said, we're doing the Galileo 7, which may seem like an odd choice considering that there are other TOS episodes that deal with the concepts of race and otherness more explicitly. I'm thinking here specifically of Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, which features aliens who destroy themselves fighting over whether having black on your left or your right side is superior. However, I chose the Galileo 7 because While the prejudice is readily identifiable, how the show addresses it isn't. We aren't seeing Star Trek putting its best foot forward. This is more along the lines of Star Trek in its bathrobe and bunny slippers. So let's talk the Galileo 7. So here's your brief synopsis. En route to deliver some much needed medical supplies to a colony suffering from a plague, the Enterprise stops to investigate a spatial anomaly per Starfleet's standing orders. Entering into the anomaly, they discover a planet within it, so Spock takes an away team in the shuttle Galileo to the planet to investigate. However, the atmosphere represents a challenge. The details don't really matter much here. The important part is that the shuttlecraft crashes to the planet's surface. Everyone survives the crash, and Spock sets about evaluating the damage and speculating about how best to address the massive problem of having very little fuel while sending 2 crew members out to do some basic reconnaissance. Latimer and Gaetano, the 2 crew members in question, do find that Taurus II, the planet, does have indigenous inhabitants when Latimer finds himself on the wrong end of a giant spear. Gaetano drives off the giant aliens with phaser fire and flees back to the Galileo. However, now that the creatures have discovered the presence of the away team in the downed shuttle, they begin to plot an organized attack. McCoy, Gaetano, and Boma are all for using their advanced weaponry to repulse the attack, but Spock gives orders to frighten rather than kill. However, the creatures have no such compunction and respond with lethal force, killing Gaetano. Spock expresses his confusion over the creature's response, and both Boma and Dr. McCoy take this rather badly, considering Spock's error resulted in a crew member's death. Spock returns his focus to working with Mr. Scott in order to get the shuttle off the ground, and they come up with a plan to use the phasers to power the shuttle, though whether they'll have the necessary thrust to break orbit remains up in the air. Boma interrupts because he wants to give Latimer and Gaetano a proper burial, and Spock disagrees, citing that it is more logical for Boma to help the living than it is to care for the dead. Boma becomes blatantly insubordinate, y'all, he's really awful, and McCoy backs him up. Spock agrees to allow them a brief funeral and continues his own work. However, the aliens return, and Spock immediately goes to keep Boma and McCoy from becoming trapped. However, a boulder falls, pinning Spock against a rock face, so he orders Boma and McCoy to leave him to his own certain death. They refuse and rescue him. Spock and Scotty get the shuttle in the air, but unfortunately they will not be able to leave the atmosphere, meaning that the shuttle will fall back to the planet if it doesn't burn up in the process. Spock decides to gamble a bit here and ignites the shuttle remaining fuel in the hopes that the Enterprise will see what is, for all intents and purposes, a giant emergency flare. Fortunately for everybody aboard the Galileo, Kirk has been dragging his proverbial feet in obeying Commissioner Ferris's demands that they abandon the away team in favor of delivering the medical supplies to Marcus II. Ergo, the Enterprise does register Spock's flare, and they're able to beam the surviving away team members out of the disintegrating shuttle. Back on the bridge, Kirk ribs Spock for making the gamble, as it seemed an act born of emotion. Spock disagrees, citing stubbornness to the amusement of the entire bridge crew. So, having worked through the episode's plot, there are a few things we're going to have to hand-wave here. We can all agree that it is very likely against protocol to send 3 of the 4 most senior officers on the same away mission. But admittedly, the only thing about the situation here is that that's unusual for TOS is that Kirk's not on the mission. We'll also set aside that Boma somehow avoids a court-martial for his behavior because no, that would not be tolerated in a real-world situation. What I do want to talk about, however, is how the away team members treat Spock. Scotty recognizes Spock's intelligence and practicality, and while it's pretty clear that he knows what's going on with the other crew members, he doesn't act on it. Boma and McCoy are outright cruel. They target Spock's difference, they target his alienness as represented by his philosophy. At one point, Boma calls Spock a machine because, as a Vulcan, he prizes logic that happens to run counter to Boma's desires. There's nothing either pretty or respectful about any of this. They target Spock for something he can't change. His species, what would in law be referred to as a suspect class, and something which he would not have to change, which he should not have to change so drastically, his culture. Note, they never offer to adapt their own beliefs or priorities to accommodate Spock. Rather, they demand that he subjugate his own cultural priorities to theirs, despite being a superior officer, and indeed, the writers clearly expect us, as viewers, to agree with McCoy and Boma. Human emotion is meant to win over Vulcan logic in this episode. Never mind that Spock is ultimately correct that the needs of the living would outweigh traditional concepts of how the dead should be treated. The writers may have wanted to make a point about compassion and dignity, but I'd argue that they don't quite succeed. What gets communicated more than anything else is that Spock's otherness is not welcome. Rather, Spock must adapt to the human crew's way of doing things. The entire premise of the episode is meant to demonstrate that sometimes the logical option isn't necessarily the right choice for a given value or right. But more importantly, what the episode really demonstrates is that for the humans, neighbor, if I may go back to an overtly Christian theme here, only partially extends to Mr. Spock. Moreover, Spock demonstrates that for him, neighbor extends much further, which seems to me a better way of being. Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan in response to being asked, "What is a neighbor?" in the context of loving one's neighbor as oneself. The Samaritan is a neighbor to the man beaten by robbers and left for dead by the roadside, because despite the traditional enmity between the Samaritans and the Jews, he acts to care for the injured man with no expectation of recompense. While biblical exegesis falls outside my wheelhouse, I will leave that to experts. The charge Jesus makes here is pretty clear. He instructs his interlocutors, and by extension us, 2,000 years later, to go and do likewise. In the Galileo 7, Spock does do likewise, even in the face of the TARDIS 2 aliens' hostility. And yes, I realize they're not aliens. The Starfleet people would be aliens. We'll just set that aside. He still takes, but even, with respect to those creatures' hostility, he still takes care to avoid causing harm. One might say that he demonstrates mercy even where McCoy and Boma champion violence. He goes to rescue McCoy and Boma from those same creatures, aliens, pick your word. And here's where I think the episode actually offers us a touch of hope. McCoy and Boma rescue Spock in turn. The script appears to cast this as further evidence that their human emotions trump Spock's logic, but I happen to think there's a touch more to it. In that moment, McCoy and Boma remember to be neighbors, even despite their prejudice. While yes, the episode features the humans behaving fairly badly for 45 minutes, the story ultimately comes around and reminds us to love our neighbors, even when it's hard, even when they do not love us. So what the Galileo 7 gives us is really a look into Trek's first steps toward the utopia it will promise us later. The episode shows us people who are yet imperfect, but who do try and do better when it counts, both Vulcan and human.